Hello, everyone. We are very excited to have Chris Honey here today. Welcome to the Learning Salon. Chris, welcome to the Learning Salon, everyone. If you're new to the Learning Salon, a gentle reminder, it's an interdisciplinary forum where we discuss bridges and contentions between artificial and biological learning every week. We have a guest who talks about sort of 10 to 20 minutes, but tonight it might take a little bit longer. Chris has requested slightly more time, but we will harass him to make sure that the time it's not too long and that we can have a discussion. A reminder to ask a question in the Ask a Question area below and ask your clarification questions in the chat. Vote on each other's questions in the Ask a Question area so that we can sort of bring the top voted questions on screen also. Two things I want to say today before we start. First, the sort of the recent shooting in Georgia has shook a lot of our friends, a lot of us, and a lot of our Asian friends. And we understand if some of you are feeling that suffering, and just consider us sharing that pain with you. And we try very hard to be anti-racist, very active steps. A lot goes in the process of ensuring that, especially behind the scenes. So I hope that we all take some time to be there for our Asian friends during this week. Second thing I want to say is that today is the last day of the Persian year, and at 5:37 a.m. tomorrow morning, March 20th, the Earth is going into equinox, the spring equinox, which is the Persian New Year, and we all celebrate it. So for the sort of Iranian descendant friends out there who are watching Crowdcasts right now, Happy New York, Happy Nowruz, Happy New York, Happy Nowruz, and thank you for those of you who are writing that in the chat. Okay, so with those two things, I'm gonna give it to Chris by just saying, so we usually do informal introductions. Chris is obviously a professor at, assistant professor at Johns Hopkins. What I do wanna say is that I know Chris from 2013, and I remember that he was very good at Cards Against Humanity back then. So I think that some of my earlier memories of Chris. Another thing about Chris is that he's very enjoyable conversation buddy. So it's always fun to talk to Chris about basically anything. And something that's very common that you might see tonight is that he will sometimes have a confused face and he will be silent for a while before he gives his answer. And I always see that as Chris's thinking face. So hopefully you guys will get to see Chris's thinking face tonight as well. All right, Chris, you're one of the most brilliant scientists in the cog neuro area, and we're excited to see your talk. Please feel free to share your slides. Hopefully everything works. Awesome, see your slides.
Okay, you can see me? Awesome, and you can hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for the intro. Thank you for the intro, Ida. I'm going to be seeing my slides while I'm talking, so I'm not seeing people or things in the chat. So if I'm missing something, just please convert it to the audio channel. Are we all good to start? Okay. I'm going to be talking about time.
One minute, Chris. Jovo, there are people who are still thinking they're in the waiting room clicking the old link. Have you told everybody that that link is wrong? So a lot of people, I just got a text, for example, from Montreal saying he thought that he was in speaker. So can we announce, hello, everybody. If you have the link that has /25, that is the wrong link. I don't know how we're going to let them know, because if they're in, they would be hearing me. So I'm being illogical. Can we send out an email?
Correct.
Can we send an email or something, Jovo?
I think
John, I just did that. I just sent that, and people are coming here. I just sent that link in the chat of the other one, John. Everybody can see it.
Okay, I'm sorry, Chris, but I want as many people as possible to listen to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Should I just get going in any case?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so I'm going to talk today about timescales in natural and artificial intelligence. I am starting my clock now. It's 4:14. So I'm taking every one of my minutes that I'm allowed. Okay. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about this idea that has become more widespread in the last few years of a timescale hierarchy in the human brain. And because this is the Learning Salon, I also want to tell you a little bit about some thoughts that we've been having and some recent experiments in the lab related to the implications of this timescale hierarchy for learning. So let's start by just thinking about hierarchy in the first place. So imagine that we have the outside world, and we've got our brains, and we want to count the steps from the outside world. So there's the outside world, and that's one step, that's another step, and there's more steps, right? And you might ask the question, where are the most interior parts of this network? What is in some sense the innermost core of the cerebral cortical network? And the answer to this question, roughly speaking, is the following. The areas that you're seeing here marked in red are the interior world, and the areas that are closer in blue are closer to the sensory cortices, and these are the exterior world. Now, you might ask a question also, is what kind of information is processed in these most interior parts of our brains? And there are a lot of answers to this question. One answer that I'm going to give you is drawing on an Al Pacino film clip. So this is Al Pacino in context. I want to play for you a short clip from this Al Pacino movie, Dog Day Afternoon, 1975. Hopefully everybody will be able to hear it. Did the movies play? No? Okay. I'm just going to give up trying to play the movie. So this is an intact Al Pacino movie clip over here, and it runs for about 30 seconds. Al Pacino comes into the bank, and he rips a gun out of his little gift pack over here, and he holds up the tellers in the bank. This version of the clip on the right here is a version where all the same events happen, but the movie's been decomposed into segments that are about 1 second long and moved into a random order. And if you do an experiment where you ask which brain regions are responsive to these two different versions of the same auditory and visual local features, what you find is that these areas in blue are the areas that are entrained only by the intact movie, whereas the rest of the colored areas are basically entrained by all of the stimuli. Now, you notice that these areas that are entrained only by the intact movie are also these areas that are our interior world. Narratives reach deep inside of us. This is kind of the take home from this. Now, this idea of kind of thinking about brain networks as having this exterior and interior, one of the most influential versions of this idea goes back to Marcel Machula in 1998. He proposed this kind of layers of the onion model. The green network here is a visual network, the visual pathways. The blue is the auditory pathways. And then in pink, you have these kinds of transmodal, heteromodal, paralimbic kinds of regions that are closer to the further from the periphery and less specific to one particular modality. The point that I want to make is that the default mode network is basically in the core of our internal milieu. Now, what is the function of these default mode network regions? There are a lot of answers to this question. This set of regions is called the default mode network. It's called the mentalizing network. It's called the narrative network. It is also called the emotion network. It's also called the memory network, roughly speaking. And one version of an answer to this question of what its function is that it's good for representing scenarios, and it helps us to answer questions and process information related to the who, what, why, and where of situations in the world or alternative worlds. So it's been associated with processes of self-projection, projecting yourself into an alternate scenario, and mental transportation. Okay, so I imagine many of you will be familiar with the default mode network. It's one of the most kind of exciting ideas, I guess, of the last decade or two. People are really interested in the system. And today I want to present you with a slightly different view on how we should think about the function of the system and its kind of place in the larger cortical hierarchy. So I'm going to propose a timescale hierarchy in the human brain. And this is going to be work I'll describe today that was led by a grad student, Sherry Chan, who is terrific. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and map the processing timescale of different brain regions. So how can we measure the timescale of neural processing? What we're going to do is we're going to present a stimulus. Let's say it's an auditory stimulus, a sentence like this: I'm 5,000 feet above Albany on a perfect day, beautiful blue sky. And then we're going to present a version of the stimulus that is, we're going to measure the brain response in a particular region. And then we're going to change the past, right? And we're going to ask whether the response to this particular moment in the stimulus is changed when we change the past. If the response is not changed by changing the past at some particular scale here, then the time scale of processing must be shorter than the scale of this this black box over here, right? But if the time scale is longer than this black box, then changing the past is actually going to change the neural response. So the kind of processing time scale is, roughly speaking, the time window over which, if you change information outside of that window, it doesn't change the response. So we did this experiment. We had two groups of participants. There's the gray group and the black group, and they're going to be listening to sometimes the same spoken sentences and sometimes not. And we're going to be focusing on this moment where they start to hear the same sentences. And we're going to ask, how similar are the responses in their brains as they are processing these identical auditory inputs? In particular then, so we're going to have auditory inputs that in the past were different, but now are identical. And we're going to be measuring the correlation between the two groups, across the two groups. And the logic is going to be that if your processing time scale is shorter, then you will align quickly across these two different contexts. And if you're in a brain region whose processing timescale is longer, it'll take longer for you to align across the two contexts, even though the input you're receiving is identical. We also did a part of this experiment where we measured how quickly the brain regions separate when they're exposed to different input preceded by the same context, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So we're doing this experiment where we're going to have these sentences. Let's say, in this order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in another version, 3, 5, 4, 2, 1, we're going to find the same sentence preceded by different contexts in this case. And then we're going to ask what the neural responses look like inside of segment 5, right? So the way we measure the neural responses, this is going to be fMRI. We're going to use the patterns of activation from the same region across subjects at a particular moment. So we'll go into segment 5, right? And we'll have time on the x-axis, voxels here on the y-axis, and we're measuring the correlation across two different individuals, one in the kind of the intact group and one in the scramble group, as they process the same information. And we can measure time point by time point how similar are the patterns of activation in a given patch of cortex. And so we'll get an inter-subject pattern correlation time course. And we can do this both for this comparison across groups here. We can also do it within each group. So we can ask just within the people listening to the intact or within those listening to the scramble, are they also, how reliable are the responses, how similar are the responses across individuals at each moment in time? So here's an example of what this looks like. Oh, just before we get into that, because this is fMRI, we've got to pay attention to one thing, right? So we have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ordering in the one case, and then this 3, 5, 4, 2, 1 in the other case, and we undo that, right? So we unscramble the responses, right? But because this is fMRI, remember, we measure this correlation over here. There was this hemodynamic signal that was happening, right? So that at these transitions, there was some signal that was being carried from the previous stimulus, from the previous portion of the stimulus. And that means that at the beginning of every segment, there'll be basically zero match across the two neural responses, because they're actually, what you're actually measuring at that moment comes from the previous segment, which is not matched when you do the unscrambling. Okay, so this kind of measure will always start at 0, and we're going to measure how fast it ramps up. So for example, in auditory cortex, we can look at the correlation within groups. It looks kind of like this. So on the x-axis here is time, and on the y-axis is the match, right? So within each group, the correlation is very stable as a function of time within the segment. This is true for the intact and the scrambled groups, but our curve of interest is this green curve, which is the correlation across groups. And as you can see, there's this hemodynamic effect, which makes the correlation 0 at the beginning, but then it ramps up around 4 seconds. Now we can compare this with a region like the right temporoparietal junction, and if we look over here, we see that they're fairly stable over time, over the course of the segment, but this green curve stays at 0 until about 7 or 8 seconds now. So for every brain region, we can take this green curve and we can basically ask, how long does it take to start ramping up? And if we do that, what we find is a pattern kind of like this. We're going to measure the alignment time using a logistic fit, and we can color the cortical surface according to the time for this kind of ramping to achieve its half maximum. And if we do that, you can see these gradients, both in the left and the right hemisphere. The dark red areas are those that ramp more quickly. Those in yellow are those that ramp more slowly. So just to kind of summarize what we're seeing here, this is saying that these areas, for example, the area in yellow, are areas where two groups of people are listening to the same stimulus. And the first group, the intact group, is producing a reliable response at every second. And the other group is also producing a reliable response. But they're totally different in this brain region until about 8 or 9 seconds into the stimulus, right? So this is saying that the responses are in some sense deeply context sensitive. Okay, this is just one example of a way of measuring the timescale of neural processing. And this is our argument for the existence of kind of a local context representation that's distributed across the cortical surface. Now, we've done experiments using intracranial recordings as well that have shown similar kinds of effects. We've done experiments that with and without language. So this is not a language-specific phenomenon. And the rough story altogether is that the timescales of information processing vary hierarchically across the cortex. And as we move from the outer to innermost parts of the cortical network, brain regions begin to integrate information over longer windows. Okay. Now, there's a funny thing that is related to this phenomenon. You could ask the question, where are brain dynamics intrinsically the slowest? And one way to do this, it seems like it's kind of a silly way, because fMRI is kind of a terrible tool for answering this question, you would think. But if you just take the bold signal and you just ask, what does the power spectrum of the bold signal look like in different regions? And you can cluster regions according to their spectra. You find that the spectra are flatter in some regions and steeper in other regions, and it's roughly 1/f everywhere. So those that are the steepest are those that have the highest proportion of slow dynamics. And what you find is, those are the blue areas marked here, those are the same areas that have a long time scale of kind of context sensitivity. So these areas, you can measure their response even in the absence of any stimulus. And yet there's this actually quite strong correspondence here between how sluggish their dynamics are and how much prior information that they are sensitive to during the processing of ongoing information streams. Another way to see this phenomenon was shown very elegantly by Chris Baldessano in a paper from a few years ago. So you can just ask about these kind of, you can cluster patterns of brain state in time and ask how many kind of event states are there per unit time. How rapidly do brain regions transition between states? So in an area like V1, you have the X and the Y axis here. This is the correlation across time points. You can see that there's a certain amount of blockiness, but not very much. But if you go to an area like the posterior medial cortex, you find that time points are highly correlated. And this is on the scale of about 45 seconds or more here, right? So this is saying that these these higher order regions, these areas in the default mode network, the innermost core, really can maintain stable states for a long period of time, surprisingly stable states. 2 points that are worth mentioning. The first is that we're not saying that these timescales are like a fixed time constant, right? There's a mixture of timescales in every region, and you can see that even in the bold data, because these are, 1/f spectra. And the other thing to notice here is that there's a kind of a resetting phenomenon that can rapidly shift the state, and you can see that in these kind of how sharp some of these blocks can be in the Baldessano data I'm showing. Okay, so this is just to say that as we move from the outer to innermost parts of the cortical network, brain regions integrate information over longer windows, and brain regions exhibit more sluggish dynamics. So both of these phenomena are happening. One is a kind of a functional process about how you process information. The other one is something that's just about the intrinsic properties of the local dynamics. And we now know, due to the work of other labs, that this is also correlated with things like myelination and the density of the number of spines on excitatory pyramidal neurons, for example. Okay, so a very, very brief kind of historical recap of this kind of branch of ideas. Up until about 2007, these are some of the main papers that were talking about the ideas of having multiple timescales and the implications of that. And a lot of it's in the realm of learning. A lot of it is theoretical. There was some very spatially coarse theorizing, but very kind of far-seeing work done by Finnish groups in the 90s on this. But then around 2008, there's this real transition where we started to get the first kind of high-quality mapping of these phenomena, and as well as new developments in the modeling. And now, in the last decade, it's just been an explosion of work linking these phenomena to clinical outcomes, to kind of microstructure of the cerebral cortex. There have been a lot of different directions this has been taken. Okay. So this is to say, there's a timescale hierarchy in the human brain. Higher order regions integrate information over longer time windows, and higher order regions exhibit slower dynamics. So I think I've taken about 17 minutes, and I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about some of the implications for learning, but feel free to just shut me down when I'm talking for too long about this, okay? So timescales of real-world learning. The first thing, just to kind of pitch this, actually, I'll skip this. So you might ask, how do these slow changing internal states actually affect learning? And this is work led by an excellent grad student in my lab, Shima Rahimi Mogadam. So you might ask, isn't there a problem here, right? Doesn't this autocorrelation I just told you about blur information over time? So, if you're going to have these very static states, isn't that going to be a problem for credit assignment? So, if you're trying to, for example, learn the name of an entity, perform some kind of categorization task, isn't it going to be a problem that you have this mixture of past and present information, of past and present states? So there are two wrinkles to the story. The first one is that in the real world, sure, your brain dynamics are changing sluggishly, but also information in the world that you care about is often changing sluggishly, right? So you can imagine that if you're in some kind of conversation with these characters, that you'll make samples that are correlated in time while you're learning. And the second thing is, maybe you can mitigate this problem with this kind of blurring information in time if you can reset this process, right? So we know that there can be these sharp boundaries that you can see over here. So we set out to look, what are the implications of this kind of blurring of information over time for neural networks? And we're going to train neural nets on the classic beginning workhorse for this, which is MNIST digits. We're going to train neural nets on sequences of MNIST digits where we sample from categories now, right? So the autocorrelation now is coming from whether we sample from the same category consecutively or not. So this is a case where we never sample consecutively from the same category, or we can sample 3 in a row from the same category. We can sample 5 in a row from the same category. We can sample just randomly from categories. And this is the standard approach in machine learning. Usually you want to just sample randomly. And in a network that has no memory, kind of a standard feed-forward neural network, it turns out that sampling randomly is actually really good. So your test accuracy is good. You learn faster if you sample randomly and you avoid repetitions. But in fact, in the case where you have leaky memory, or leaky memory put with a reset kind of rule that happens between categories, the opposite is true. And in fact, you learn faster when there are more repetitions. And in fact, not only do you learn faster when there are more repetitions, it also turns out that you learn faster even than the feed-forward memoryless network. So it's not just that you're mitigating the costs of this blurring, you actually are just learning better. It's worth mentioning that this learning better process also shows up when these models trained with leaky memory are actually being tested without any memory. So they really are learning better internal representations. And it's also the case that this effect is not kind of a statistical training artifact. These models with leaky memory do learn worse when you're training them on data where the categories are composed of random and dissimilar items. So it really depends on the fact that the training data within a category are kind of similar to each other, the training samples, right? So it's kind of like saying that this leaky memory could be thought of as an inductive bias. If the world contains categories that are kind of smooth in time, then maybe smoothing your dynamics in time it can actually be helpful. So this is ongoing work, but I wanted to share this with you. So leaky memory can speed learning when data are smooth in time. And the final thing I want to tell you is the following, that we've looked into like this lingering phenomena, this idea of smoothing yourself in time as well. So we have this question about what makes information linger in your mind and why. I'm going to skip this for now. So we know that stories can transport us into alternate worlds. And so stories also happen to linger. This is something that's a kind of a phenomenon. This is a Reddit post that convinces you of it. There's this post from Reddit with 530 comments. And the question is, does reading a book change who you are temporarily? And people posted things like, I just finished reading Angels and Demons by Dan Brown. I've been in a trance for hours. My girlfriend can't communicate properly with me because I seem to phase out every now and then. And then I realized I was thinking about everything that happened in the book. So we wanted to characterize this, right? Because you aren't allowed to submit Reddit posts to journals. They don't accept the Reddit posts by themselves. So we're going to measure narrative lingering. We're going to have people read a narrative. This is one example of a Raymond Carver short story. They're going to read it sentence by sentence on a screen. And then before and after they read the narrative, we're going to do a free association task. So they're going to see words on the screen and they're going to type whatever word they want next. There's going to be a chain of words they'll just generate in a free association task. And we're going to measure this before and after. We're also going to ask them whether the story lingered in their mind. We're going to ask them how transported they were by the story. And we're going to ask them for their memory of the story. And what we find is that narratives do linger in mind. The narrative lingers. If you ask people to report their lingering, people who read the narrative report that it lingered. Those who read a word-scrambled version of the narrative do not report that it lingered. And people will just spontaneously report. They'll say, I struggled more during the free association task because my mind kept going back to the text and not the words I was working with, right? So this is not word priming. This is something more conceptual. It's something that's kind of inside of us and kind of distracting us in some sense. And what is it about the story that lingers? Content of the story. The story that the people read here was actually involved a lot of it's kind of a dark, kind of rural, kind of family mystery thing. There's a lot of content from the story that's lingering in people's free association chains, right? Then there's the question of why do stories linger? And this is the last thing that I want to say. I'm going to speculate that narratives produce a kind of mental transportation, or sometimes kind of induce you to perform mental transportation. That in turn means that the information that you're processing in the narrative is somehow getting wrapped up in this internal milieu in the DMN. And that in turn means that you're involving slow brain dynamics, and that in turn leads to lingering mental states. Of course, this is highly speculative. Now, here's some data. We can look at people's reports of how transported they were while they were exposed to the stimulus. And then we can look at how that relates to their reports of later on the lingering of information while they're doing subsequent tasks. And what we find across a large number of stimuli is that there's a very robust relationship between how transported you were during the initial kind of task you're performing and it kind of lingering in your mind later. And this occurs even when people were doing very, very boring tasks. Some people were just looking at sequences of random words, and to the extent that they, for whatever reason, imposed a kind of meaning on it, they were transported by it and it lingered in their minds later. So more transportation leads to a kind of deeper processing, and that leads to this lingering in our minds. Okay, so that's the last thing I wanted to say. So there's this timescale hierarchy in the human brain. Higher order regions integrate information over longer time windows. Higher order regions exhibit slower dynamics. There's this idea that maybe the slower dynamics aren't entirely a problem for learning. So leaky memory can actually improve learning of smooth data streams. And we think that deep neural processing lingers for minutes. I didn't mention this, but it also predicts better memory. Okay, that's all I had to say. Thank you very much, and I apologize for going a few minutes over time.
Thank you, Chris. That was very interesting.
Who wants to start?
I haven't started for quite a while.
Yeah,
Is that
you should
okay?
go. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, Chris, first of all, I love these kinds of ingenious experiments. I mean, I really find it's also going from 0 to 60. 1 minute we're talking about sort of processing of something quite truncated, and then we've got lingering stories and narrative. And I haven't really thought about this enough. I'm afraid today I didn't really have a chance to read the TICS article or the Neuron paper, but I'm having a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? On the one hand, that you say that there's something intrinsic to the substrate that makes it slower, right? Which means that if I were to give that bit of tissue the same stimulus compared to a bit of tissue elsewhere, they would be slower based just on the properties of the substrate, right? But then, on the other hand, I was under the impression that the slowness was something about the nature of the content and the computation, that in fact, construction of narrative across these longer time windows is just a different beast to just processing this less meaning imbued fragment. So which is driving the other? In other words, there's a big difference from saying that this is due to narrative construction and just saying it's a slightly dumb piece of tissue, right? So which one is it?
Well, I kind of feel like it's a false dichotomy, right? This is an evolved system. So I think that the two reinforce each other, right? Over evolutionary time. This is I mean, again, I'm not going to have strong evidence for this, but I
don't think that when you, I mean, but then if you're going to have a theory as to why the likelihood of having bleed in to that small window because it's been put in the context, because context is a slippery word, right? Context is a slightly low-level cognitive operation versus I actually understand that whole Al Pacino episode. He's robbing the bank, right? So there's more to imbuing that whole scene with meaning than just saying the word context, right? In other words, it could have been that he was in a blue bank versus a red bank, right? So I'm just trying to understand, where does this cash out in terms of a theory of what construction of narrative requires? Is it that it requires slow tissue? Is it that it requires, I mean, is meaning of a scene just about slow tissue?
So I certainly is not the claim that that, you know, if I were to present you with any piece of information, and for whatever reason I could make you kind of sustain processing and make it slow or sustained, that would somehow make it narrative-like. I think that is.
So that's right, but that's what it sounds like you're saying. So what does make it narrative-like?
So Well, so we ran an experiment I'll tell you about.
But am I wrong, before you tell me about that, am I wrong that you haven't actually told us, other than this proxy of slow tissue, about how narrative, what the requirement or how computationally narrative is constructed, right?
Does he need to say that?
Yeah,
yes. I mean, I'm just saying, I'm just saying, yes, he does. I'm just saying that what is the theory of narrative that is maybe supported by slow tissue, but processing in slow tissue doesn't just acquire the status of narrative.
Oh, yeah, so I don't want to come. So in the beginning, I extremely hurriedly mentioned that the default mode network has like 6 different names, and one of them is the narrative network, and it is there are people like Raymond Marr in Toronto, for example, who specifically have studied, like, you know, from narrative theory, how things like, for example, the presence of agents and the presence of goals and theory of mind and mentalizing, and how are these elements located kind of in the kind of the humanities side of what narrative is, and then how do those cash out in terms of what people think is going on in different subsets of the DMN. So one cartoon version of this, this is fully cartoon, right, is like the TPJ is more involved in the kind of the theory of mind side of things. The posterior medial cortex is involved in the spatial arrangement and kind of spatial scaffolding of narrative. The MPFC is involved in goal representation for yourself and for others, right? And so these systems combined, so a narrative is in some sense then composed of agents in an environment pursuing goals. And especially when there's a self agent and an other agent. And now I'm giving you some kind of, you know, butchering.
But as you know, yeah, I understand. But as you know, saying involved in is just a filler term, right? It's just saying, it's not a theory of the TPJ, right? It's saying, you know, I mean, after all, resting state studies have to always rely on activation studies to name the networks for the most part, right? It's always a little bit based on the history of functional activations to do resting state naming, because unless you and that's what lets you then correlate with measures that you know are relevant to that region because of the, so there's always something slightly strange about resting state, that it always kind of depends epistemologically on functional activations. But that's an interesting discussion for another time. But I'm just genuinely interested to know whether there's a theory, or you have in your mind some beginnings of a theory as why these deepest, slower processing areas are the ones that can begin to do, as you say, mental transportation. In other words, it's great circumstantial evidence that it seems like you have to integrate over a longer piece of the movie, but it doesn't yet answer, right, what's actually going on, right?
So I think there's 2 pieces to this, right? So the first piece is, why should these areas be involved in representations of things like spatial settings, agents, and goals, right? And then there's the second question, which is, how is it that they become employed for this kind of transportation into a narrative, right? So I think those are somewhat different questions. So, so there's a certain sense in which, so you know, so nobody has the answer to this, but the reason I think time is relevant is because the features of a situation. So for example, we're having a conversation, right? And I have some kind of sense of my goals and your goals, right? And that is a relatively stable feature of the world, relative to the kinds of features associated with the, you know, envelope of, or the level of, you know, attack, to choose a word, of a single piece of spectral energy that you generate, right, and that I process. So there's a certain sense in which, just if I'm a part of the brain that cares about things like somebody else's motivations towards me, it seems pretty convenient for me to have a bias towards a more sticky and slowly changing representation. It's not that I can't change quickly if I need to, but if I was going to have a bias, actually having it be pretty sticky is handy as a default.
Oh, the whole notion of cognition requiring sort of longer time horizons to envelop these bigger pieces is what I think is very beautiful. I think you're going to turn out, it's completely right, this idea that, you know, there's this wonderful work on, you know, subcortical structures having much shorter time windows, so they can't build, as you put, you know, you have a scene or a long sentence or a paragraph, right? You've got to envelop them in something that lingers. I love that notion of lingering circuitry, right? But I think so, if I understand it, you are showing a kind of, and I think it, you know, I think it may have been Ida even saying in the chat, a kind of buffer, a meaning buffer, a narrative buffer, that you're showing a kind of buffer structure that you're going to need. But I don't think having this buffer is the same as telling us, using the working memory analogy, what computation is being performed on that buffer to actually construct the narrative. And I think, so would that be fair that, you know, maybe you don't like the word, but it just seems to me you've given us an argument for the need for a buffer, and you've may show us through the dynamics where the buffer might be, which is in these red regions of the interior mind. But how that buffer's used, we have to sort of base on trust at the moment, right?
Well, I mean, so there's two pieces to this. The first I want to say is that I don't think we should describe these processes as working memory processes. I think
No, I was not. I strictly said that, like, analogously to that, I'm just saying that, as you said, you need to hold on for a particular period of time, something slow. I'm just using it analogously, right? A buffer for narrative is what I'm saying, is what you seem to be describing.
Well, so there's one point I just wanted to mention, which is, I'm going to emphasize why I think this is the case, is that working memory, you know, the kind of working memory, true working memory is this very capacity limited phenomenon. It's very related to attentional selection processes. And I think that a lot of these processes are a little bit closer to kind of the unconscious. They are very, very high capacity parallel kinds of systems, and you can select and operate on them. So if you're stopping while reading a story and you have to suddenly think about, why is this character doing it, then it starts to become a little bit more like a reasoning and working memory-ish kind of process. But I think that there's an enormous amount of other information that we absorb in a narrative, and it doesn't have that character. And I think that these processes, this kind of very sluggish stuff that I'm describing, a lot of it is that, right? So it's really very fundamentally different from the working memory.
So just so I know, it's not, I understand what you're saying, interestingly, that even within this bigger buffer, if you want to reason, well, why would that character have lied in that moment? Then you have that little incursion of this reasoning within the working memory. So what is the content of this unreasoned piece? In other words, what is it? I mean, what are you constructing there?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on the region, right? Obviously, there's, you know, this kind of picture spans basically entire cerebral cortex, so there's not going to be one answer to that question. Let's consider a candidate answer. Okay, so let's consider the case of language, and let's suppose I'm just going to be an example, okay? And I don't have a great answer to this, but let's consider language, and let's suppose that we try and build language models where we have a prior that we build into the language model. It could be an RNN, or it could be some other kind of language model. And we're going to make it so that some parts of the internal state of this language model as a prior just forget, they're just less prone to changing their state. They're just made sluggish by the architecture, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then my prediction is going to be that information that is about, let's say, immediate word following, you know, on the scale of like 1 or 2 tokens, let's say, in a token level word model, is going to end up being more encoded in the nodes that are given the bias towards the fast timescales. Things like some aspects of syntactic information are going to be in the kind of more intermediate timescales, And then like discourse level information about, for example, motivations and goals, to the extent that the language model can ever capture those. Some language models might be able to capture some of that, are going to end up in the longest timescales. So,
but yeah, and that makes complete sense to me. But just want to finish by saying that it just feels like that when you get to sort of the semantic component, right? It actually looks like something that you have to be following with something like reasoning. So this is, it seems like you're still having to set the scene, right? Or
I think
sorry. So maybe John,
yeah.
we can move on, and then you can ask your questions again, because we're already like close to 5.
Yeah. So, but anyway, Chris, it's really great. We'll talk more. But it's there's something I feel like it's a stepping stone towards the construction, and you've given the architecture for the timescales.
Jova, do you want to go next? Thank you, John. Of course, we'll come back to you again, John.
No, it's fine. You're right to shut me up.
Just trying to keep time.
Is someone keeping track of John saying that? Like just a time point so we can come back to it later?
One day we'll make a reel out of all of this. Jova, go ahead.
All right. I'll try to be quick. Chris, that was really fun. I remember reading about your work 10 years ago on like connectomics and predicting function from structure, and now knowing about all your timescale stuff. And I never really thought about how it was all connected, really. And I think the talk today, you really connected it for me very nicely. So I'm really grateful for that kind of overview. I had a couple maybe quick questions. So the multi-scale time thing, I think is cool. And I'm a big advocate for multi-scale stuff, multi-scale representations. We're big fans of here in the Learning Salon, as you may know. And so, when I think about multi-scale behaviorally, for me, the timescales are like a year, a decade, a generation. And what you showed was multi-scale time on like a second, a minute, which, there's obviously behavioral or experimental limitations. But what do you say to me about like, how am I representing my plan for 20 years from now? Like, there's no region for that. Is there?
So that's a great question. So I really do think that this framework, this idea of a hierarchy, it makes the most sense on the scale from around a second to a minute, or like half a second out to a minute. Just to be clear, what I was presenting, there's a separate story in the MTL, in the medial temporal lobes, where there's evidence for multiple scales within the medial temporal lobe. And before I get into that, let me just say, you can imagine an experiment with an amnesic, a person who has MTL damage, right? We've presented these people with, in the scanner, with narratives. And we can look at the context representation of these people as they're making sense of a narrative. And our rough sense, this is not work that I was the lead on, but I was involved in it. The rough sense is that when they're listening to a narrative and the narrative is coherent, right? If it's incoherent, it's over, right? That's kind of, they just cannot integrate across really discontinuous things. But if the narrative is kind of coherent, they can kind of stay with it. They'll get it. They'll understand the jokes, for example, on the scale of around maybe 30 seconds to 2 minutes, somewhere in there. They can't really do much more than that. So roughly speaking, and this is extremely roughly speaking, I think that stitching things together beyond that scale, and especially when you have discontinuities like changes in topic or whatever, that you start to need the hippocampus. So there's a paper by Janice Chen related to this. Okay, so now then there's also work. So Ida's been involved in some of this work. Mark Howard's been involved in some of this work. There's also some work from Eva Brunic and Maros Moskovich's lab looking at kind of gradients of timescale within the MTL. I'm less of an expert in that. I know that gradients exist. So I know that. So I think of that as a different kind of process, because basically once you can once you can teleport in time, like the hippocampus can move you back 5 minutes or a year. And so I feel like it may be using fundamentally computationally similar processes to do both of those. Like, I don't feel like what I'm presenting today kind of encompasses that. I feel like that is kind of its own story. I hope that it's related, but I don't know how it's related. So there is a hierarchy in the MTL, and it is functionally very important, but I don't think it has the same underlying mechanisms, for example, as the one I was describing, right? So the sluggishness, I don't think interact in the same way, but I could be wrong. They could have a more deep fundamental connection that I don't understand.
I see. Okay, thanks. That was helpful. And then the other question I had is about your really intriguing slide where you showed basically if you make your feed-forward deep net leaky, that it learns faster, which is, I think really interesting. And I think we all know that deep learning, and not just deep learning, every machine learning algorithm for the most part just gets images or whatever's in random order. And you're showing that that's problematic and a purported solution to it. So, but my question is, like, how general is that thing? Like, it's easy to find, well, maybe not easy, but I guess the question is, like, when does that work and when does it fail, I guess? And it certainly doesn't always work. Yeah. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, what are the conditions for which that you would want to do that? Because you showed a condition for which you would want to, but now I want to know all the conditions for which you would not want to, and then I'll understand it.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So here's my current thought on this, right? So we chose MNIST just because it's often where you start when you're just testing something, right? And MNIST has this property where the images are all kind of in the same, the digits are kind of like located in the same location in space, and even their features are going to be like where the location of the bottom left corner of the 2 will be. We'll have some kind of consistency across samples, right? So you could imagine a version of MNIST where the images are located all over the place, where this averaging procedure is just going to be completely useless. It'll be terrible, right? So in the brain, though, the parts of the brain that tend to do the smoothing the most tend to be pretty deep. So those parts of the brain might be representing features that are fairly invariant, right, or fairly abstracted as well. So my thought is, so for example, in the context of if I'm doing this for face processing, for example, maybe you want to build a network that it does have this slow dynamic in it, but you only put that in the deep layers of the net. It'll only work when it's in the deep layers of the net, for example, because that's the level of representation at which the autocorrelation of the features in the training data is useful. So I'm giving you a circular answer because I'm just saying that there's some level at which the representation is useful, right? I'm not telling you what it is, and I don't know. So I don't know the general answer, but I do think that it will extend beyond the case of MNIST because of what I just said, which is that you don't have to put the slowness in every layer. You can choose to put the slowness in a part of the network, which is or the other machine learning system that is not a neural network. You can choose to put it in the subsystem that is receiving usefully autocorrelated samples, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I don't know in general, but I'm optimistic. Yeah. We're just starting. Yeah.
And then just real quick, just a clarification question. The x-axis there was like iterations. There was like SGD iterations when you had a mini batch size of like 1.
Yes.
So it's like you didn't even let the network learn per sample. You're kind of like investigating it, but as it's even learning just one sample at a time, because it takes many SGD steps to converge even for just one sample, right? So it's this weird to get those curves that go up so slowly, MNIST with a deep net or whatever, curves go up to like 100% with like, 6 samples or whatever. So yeah, I wonder how fragile it is to MNIST, the particulars of the experiments and stuff like that. But I think it would be really interesting to investigate it more thoroughly.
Well, so I should say we also get the effect. We have done it with batching as well, but it's just that the story gets really complicated once you combine this with batching, as you can imagine.
Right.
I think the important thing to say about this is that it's not the same as batching. It's not the same as something like momentum, because those processes don't depend in the same way in the properties of the data stream, right? So momentum and batching are still going to work fine if you have these really weird categories that were composed of totally disparate elements. So this is really something that, and I agree with you. A key question is how much does this generalize? And this is where we are right now.
Yeah, and I think 2 really cool steps and interesting directions you showed, which is great.
Hi, Chris.
Yeah, Ida.
Prague. Jobo, I just put in the chat for you. After myself, Needy and Cynthia will be on screen. So I'm surprised by this idea of inner outer, because first of all, hippocampus has different time scales, and it's not its inner outer. It's just like, the posterior, anterior axis, and they're all inner. And second of all, anterior prefrontal cortex is the sort of the slowest of everywhere, and it's kind of outer. I don't know, unless you are considering inner outer in a different way or mapping a globe into like you're inside outing it. I don't know how you're considering it, but in the prefrontal cortex, the more outer you are, the higher towards the frontal pole, the higher the time scales are. Whereas in the posterior brain, in the visual cortex, the more outer you are, the faster things are. Like you go to V1, the faster changing it is. So I'm a little confused what you mean by inner outer, because it doesn't hold up for hippocampus or MTL in general, and it doesn't hold up for prefrontal cortex.
Wait, I just want to make sure, just on the empirical side, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying as you go anterior in the prefrontal cortex, it gets slower?
Yeah.
And you think more anterior prefrontal cortex is more outer?
Yes.
I don't have that.
As it is close to my skull.
Oh, but what I mean by inner outer is I mean that I had this little slide right at the very beginning where I was doing these like hops from the world. Like how many steps from the world are you in the brain network? Does that make sense? Like no. So, like if I have a network and I just define certain nodes as the periphery of the network, and then I measure for every node what's the shortest path to the periphery of the network, and then the inner part of the network is the part of the network that is as far as possible from all of the peripheral nodes.
Anterior prefrontal cortex also encodes visual stimuli sometimes, especially when it's holding it in working memory. So it's not necessarily too far.
Yeah. So there are many. So there are actually many counterexamples to this.
Yeah.
There's also some shortcut paths through the thalamus, like weird paths through the that can lead to all kind of parts of the brain. I'm still kind of attached to this idea. So roughly speaking, I don't think it's what I said in the beginning about network hops. I think it's kind of like your first pass idea of how you would do this. But I think a more meaningful idea of how you would do this is that you would look at kind of causal sensitivity to perturbations of the environment, of the immediate sensory environment. And we actually have a paper where we kind of said that. But I just think that the network hops thing is an easier thing to communicate in a few seconds. But
I don't think it's accurate, though. I understand that the message inner outer is a simpler message, but I don't think it's accurate, especially when it comes to also the hierarchy in the hippocampus.
So you would agree with me if the graph was not an anatomical graph, but a causal graph, then you would agree with me.
I don't know, because I'm not sure if it's as straightforward as you have in mind. I think there are some, like I said, because of the kinds of examples that we see, sometimes there are some shortcuts, whether it's via thalamus or somewhere else. I think the reachability, and ironically, it becomes a little bit like a successor representation at some point, which is if you look at the multi-step connections that exist, some of them don't actually, I'm not sure if there is one network where you can measure number of steps from the outer world because of some functional connectivity that sometimes shortcuts things, especially depending on the task demand. Like sometimes the visual stimuli being decodable from anterior PFC.
Well, I think this is just an empirical question, right? So like my causal version. Yeah.
Sorry, go.
Yeah.
I don't quite understand, Ida. Are you saying that you think there isn't a good first order model at all, or you think the one Chris posed is wrong?
I think the idea of the inner outer is not quite accurate because of the number of exceptions, as Chris was mentioning as well. I mentioned some of them. There are other exceptions that exist. So I don't think that simple picture of the inner outer holds. Now, Chris says, what if I had a different measure that we don't have so far? I'm still not sure if it's helpful because of some kind of short circuits that happens in the brain because of functional connectivity for certain kinds of tasks as opposed to others. So I'm not quite convinced that as a theoretical construct, even assuming, there is the theoretical proposal and there is what has been measured so far. Chris and I both agree what has been measured so far doesn't account for it. Chris is saying, what if we had this other measure? I'm not quite sure if the theoretical construct is helpful.
I don't want to totally throw out my hops thing. Like I think the hops thing is bad because it has these obvious counterexamples, but I'm still not convinced that if I was like was it the Greeks who had like the kind of hydraulic theories of brain function? Like if you just so there are these shortcuts, but the question is how, if I'm a particular brain region in the frontal cortex, what proportion of my dynamics is driven by those shortcuts versus the long cuts, right? I still have this intuition that if I was like driving the system, it was like a linear system. I was just driving stuff in the periphery, and I just measure the response. The sites that on average, that have an average number of hops that are longer, right? Because those shortcut paths, I just don't know that they're the kind of the primary driver of the bulk of the neurons in those regions. But again, I just don't know that we have the data to resolve it. It may just be like, yeah.
Right. We all have, so both of us have different multi-scale models. I think like maybe, you're right that,
for hippocampus, I think, my story totally doesn't account for it.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think it was okay in cortex.
Hippocampus and prefrontal cortex are my favorite regions. So that's why I was like, wait a second, this doesn't hold for PFC and it doesn't hold for hippocampus.
I kind of think it holds for PFC. I don't think it holds for hippocampus. So maybe, yeah.
I think that Elle Duvel, she was also mentioning that for hippocampus, this wouldn't make sense. So I just want to shout out to her in the chat she was saying earlier. Another thing that both Cynthia, Elle, and myself were discussing is for many of us who come from, I'm just looking at the chat, it's going fun. People are talking about Freud somehow. So the Leaky competitive accumulator has been used, LCAs have been used as a model for modeling working memory, especially in neural network building since 2001, at least, when Usher and McLellan sort of wrapped it together. But it goes back even further back generally to evidence accumulation. So the idea that there could be accumulators at different scales, and they could be leaky accumulators, and they could be leaky competitive accumulators. So I wonder whether when you're talking about leaky, you're talking about the same thing Usher and McLellan were talking in 2001, which, as you know, because you're at Princeton, John Cohen, and all of us who worked with him, we use this in our models, or whether you're talking about something simpler, whether you're just adding a leak. And doesn't leaky memory, in principle, going back to what John was mentioning earlier, is similar to working memory, basically.
So, so certainly, I do not want to claim that all of these slow timescales that we're observing in the brain are simply a result of a leaky memory, or to claim that they are I mean, the dynamics are certainly nonlinear. Yeah, this gets really. I'm kind of being forced to reveal my like strange beliefs, I feel like, but I do feel like there might be some very interesting linear computations, or there may be some weirdly effective things you can do with leaky memory. So for example, like you're reading a book and you just start to get this kind of uneasy feeling. You know, you just start to kind of, there's some very, very low dimensional drift in just how much you like a character or how uncomfortable you are with the situation. I feel like, so there's some extremely nonlinear, highly recurrent processing that's going on to kind of support this state change. But some of that state change, like that's happening in our everyday lives, I think is kind of linear. So if that makes sense. So there may be kind of states for which the computation, you know, this is kind of what John was saying. Obviously, there's some kind of like, you know, rich cognitive stuff going on to make the inferences in some case. But once I infer that this person's untrustworthy, right, it's kind of like this leaky kind of stain on them that just sits in the narrative or in my scene representation, right? So maybe it's kind of like
leaky. Why is it leaky and not a prior?
Oh yeah, I'm just saying that at the level of at the implementation level, it's leaky. I mean, at the implementation level, it's just convenient to sustain that representation, the kind of neural implementation correlate of the representation. It's just convenient to sustain that with some kind of leaky memory.
Why leaking and not strengthened association? Because associative memory, just even Hebbian association, makes more sense. It's like, oh, this is the dangerous person or this is the untrustworthy person. That's the most important thing I need to remember about them. So associative memory is sufficient. Why leaky?
Well, I think it's a kind of because it's not about storing the relation. It's about the current representation of the current scenario. So this is actually maybe about the distinction between like MTL role and the MTL version of this and the Cortex version of this. Like, I think that in the Cortex, you can't really do that kind of association forming quickly and easily like you could in the MTL. And what you're doing in the Cortex is kind of, to a larger extent, maintaining a representation of the current scenario.
But the semanticized and consolidated information of the MTL goes and lives long-term in the Cortex at the same time. So in the Cortex, you have two things. You have the ongoing stuff, but you also have very long-term stuff that are too long-term for MTL. So yes. For instance, the map of my high school and where the bathrooms are in my high school, if I go there, now I'm actually walking there, I'm entering the door of the high school and everything. That map, that used to live in it wasn't living in my hippocampus the whole time. I just activated it via my prefrontal cortex. It sent some information, probably my lateral temporal cortices passed on some information to my hippocampus by the request of the prefrontal cortex, and now I can visually navigate it in my imagination, right? So the cortex has both of those things, the very long-term associations that are consolidated and can serve as kind of like categories and semantics and priors, but also, like you said, things that I'm processing right now.
Okay, yeah, this starts to get into this stuff about activity silent working memory versus working memory that's sustained via recurrent activity, I feel like.
One of it is just consolidated long-term memory, no longer in working memory, right?
So, I mean, there are working memory theories where just working memory is just activated long-term memory representations. I think that's, is that...
Yeah, but we're talking small time scales versus, so the face of my mom is somewhere in my cortex, the patterns, and I can activate it whenever I want, right? That is long-term memory, but it's in the cortex, it's consolidated. It's not just working memory when it's living there. When I activate it, it's working memory, but there's somewhere where the pattern actually lives, and my hippocampus just has the address. So PPFC sends the address and it gets activated there. That part is no longer working memory. What I'm trying to say is the cortex is not just working memory, and it's not just temporary memory. It has long-term memories.
Oh, yes. No, for sure. I'm just saying is that this leaky memory story that I'm talking about, like, I don't think that, I think it's mostly just a process that reflects the ongoing processing rather than, so the long-term memories are certainly a necessary component. You need to be able to retrieve them. They're like super important, like schemas, super important, right? But I think about it as kind of, after you retrieve the what your mom's face, when you're having further thoughts about it, it's remaining. That's the part that I think the leaky memory is
okay, that's helpful.
playing a role in. Yeah.
Right. So we're not saying that cortex is all leaky. No,
and I want to emphasize again, even within a region, there's variation. So you can actually, I think this is, was it Ulanovsky's lab? Even in auditory cortex, you have neurons with long timescales, like auditory adaptation timescales and things, right? So there's a spectrum of timescales within every region. It's just the balance is happening. You can't, obviously, you can't have everything be slow. I mean, yeah. So, but to get to this point, so I do think I do think that one of the reasons that I think this kind of picture is helpful is it helps to explain, I think, why are songs 2 or 3 minutes long usually? Like, why are pop songs why don't they just give you the melody and the hook and then end? It's like 15 seconds. Because they just repeat the same stuff over and over again. Like, why are movies, why couldn't a movie just be like the trailer? Those trailers that just tell you the entire movie, right? If all that mattered was getting the relevant information, like, about the agents and their goals, if that's all that mattered, then you could just or read the Wikipedia summary of the TV show, right? People do that because they're too anxious about reality. I know a lot of people who read Wikipedia summaries of TV shows because they can't face the reality of the show, because the actual reality of the show is gripping the inside of your self. It's going deep into that, I'm claiming, my innermost self. And whereas the Wikipedia summary does not do that. Wikipedia summary kind of like, gently massages a little bit and instantiates a couple representations, but these full-on movies and narratives, they've got you like under their control.
Chris, I just what I find interesting is I agree with you that there's something different, although a lot of people watch highlights, as you say, and trailers. But what I find is that you're making a very big issue pivot at the moment on a single kind of temporal finding. I mean, I just think that it's carrying a lot of baggage, what you're talking about. In other words, as Ida says, is there short-term memory, long-term memory? I mean, what you're trying to posit is some clue to a representation of a scenario that you can operate on, right? You keep saying that there's a scenario. So yes, you're positing some kind of scenario representation which has a certain temporal dynamics, which is a useful representation for lingering and books and narrative. But it's a lot to sort of, to use the narrative example. You're at chapter 1 and you're already jumping to chapter 10 in terms of what you think chapter 1 means, right? It just seems a lot that you're...
Oh, yeah. No, I fully say, the stuff, how are you going to do the experiments? But just to be clear though, I'm not saying the system is for confronting scenarios for reading. It's the opposite. This system is for representing the world, the state of you in the world. It's where am I, what am I doing, and what is going on. This is what organisms use as their top level representation, right? Then human beings over time develop these cultural products which hijack that machinery. When they develop those cultural products, an effective way or a necessary feature to really hijack the machinery is you have to make the stuff extended in time. You get a different, if you give that system information at the scale that it likes, you much more powerfully control it than if you give it information at the scale that it doesn't like. There was a kind of a matched filter thing, I think, in the comments that I saw, which I think is a kind of an appropriate idea.
So just to summarize the two questions that I asked, and they were both kind of clarification questions. First, the inner-outer idea does not account for the hippocampus, and you agree. And whether it accounts for the prefrontal cortex, we don't agree on. I think it doesn't. You think it might if you had the causal approach that you're saying you might do later. Second, when you're talking about leaky memory, you are not talking about Usher and McLellan 2001 leaky competitive accumulators, which is how we've been using the term leaky memory in the modeling. That you're using it in a different way. But is there a link between the two, or can you clarify whether there is a link between the two?
So I think that actually so I can't remember what the actual equation form is for the Usher and McLellan model, so I'm not sure. But I'm pretty sure that the leaky memory I'm talking about is just a standard, x of t is equal to 1 minus alpha, x of t minus 1 plus alpha times the input. Like it's like a linear integrator. It's like the simplest filter that you look at. So that's what I mean by having a leaky memory. Is just that 1 minus alpha term in that equation. And I'm pretty sure that I'm pretty sure the Usher and McLellan model is just has that form. It is linear in the history, as I recall. Yeah.
So I guess like yours might be closer to maybe it's like a Radcliffe kind of thing. Like I'm trying to.
But again, there's nothing especially important about the functional form that I'm proposing. And again, so in Shima's study, we just chose that because it's a simple way to implement this kind of blurriness in time.
Right.
That was only in that particular study. The other stuff, the empirical data, in fact, we know for a fact, so I should say, there's work from Xiaojing Wang's lab, from Rishidev Chowdhury and from John Murray, looking at different kinds of models, nonlinear models, for how you get, and then linking these to kind of classic working memory, PFC kinds of accounts, right? So models where you can tune the recurrence parameter and you can go all the way from a kind of like a leaky memory to a self-sustaining, attractor, right? So, and again, I'll just unpack this. There are, I'd say, 3 kinds of classes of sources of the slow dynamics. Class 1, if you just have any kind of slow filtering process and you just stack them consecutively, the dynamics just get slower as you move through the stack. That's the first one, right? If you keep low pass filtering something, then it gets slower and slower. That's the first reason things become slower as you go in. The second reason is that the density of recurrent connections on pyramidal neurons increases as well as you move from the sensory cortex deeper into the brain. And the third reason is that there are just membrane, like single neuron time constant kinds of effects also that vary as you move deeper into the brain. And as far as I can tell, I spent a year or two hoping to try and pull apart these different accounts of the slow dynamics just at the intrinsic timescales. And at this point, I'm not sure that I know how. I mean, maybe in mouse or something you could do it, or maybe in zebrafish or other systems where we have incredible genetic control. But in other systems, I just have no idea how you even go about pulling apart these different accounts. And the modeling work suggests that all of them are relevant. All of them contribute.
So Q puts an interesting comment in the chat comparing LCA with the equation that you mentioned. And he says that both of them make the hidden state autocorrelated. So it seems like that sort of makes sense. I'm not entirely sure still if you're using the term leak in the same way they're using, etc. But I'll take a look at that later. Okay, so we are at 5:30 and we have a lot of questions. So I think it's time for us to invite Nidhi and Cynthia were our first or top voted questions before. Let me check again. Yeah, it's still okay. So Nidhi, Cynthia, and then Brad and Mohammed, that's there. And then Kevin. Okay. I'm guessing that Jova is inviting them. Perfect. Hi, Nidhi.
Hi, Nini.
I can't hear you all again. I'm having the same issue.
Can you hear?
You.
Okay,
We hear
good.
you.
So let me ask. Okay, so let me ask the question and then leave. Yeah. So for someone like me who doesn't really work with fMRI, I was just wondering, how do you convince yourself that it's the right data to ask these questions about, autocorrelation or time scales? Like, can you say what kind of a control experiment you could do where you expect certain time scales to show up and then you measure it and test it, for instance? And yeah, that's the question.
So yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So the short answer is that you should not trust fMRI. The reason that we trust the data now is because we did the experiments with intracranial recordings in humans. The other reason is people have done the experiments in non-human primates. And so you can find these timescale gradients at the level of autocorrelation in single units. You can find it in the field potentials and intracranial recordings. I'm not sure if it's been done in MEG. I think it has. So basically, that's the reason that we're confident in it. One thing that's worth mentioning here, though, and there are lots of reasons to really worry about physiological confounds in the fMRI. I'm totally with you. When we first started looking at the autocorrelation structure in the intracranial recordings, we were really surprised at how much of the variance in the intracranial recordings is slow. So if you just look at the power spectrum of power fluctuations in these intracranial recordings in humans, it's roughly 1/f. It's not so. It looks a little bit like the 1/f structure of the bold signal. And so the way that the literature in fMRI is, if you go to it, everyone in the 90s was writing like, well, we see this 1/f stuff in the bold signal. So obviously we have some kind of instrumental artifacts and physiological artifacts. Let's try and make a list of all of them and show how all of this stuff arises. Funnily, it turns out that there's actually plenty of signal in the ultra slow portions of the fMRI signal. Importantly, also, the very, very slow parts of the fMRI signal, they are stimulus locked. And they are sensitive to content. If you do this experiment that I described with the scrambled movie and the intact movie, it's actually the slow component of the neural dynamics that is especially sensitive to whether the structure of the movie is intact or scrambled. It's also the case that when you do the fMRI experiment, you can do the power spectral analysis only on the component of the fMRI signal that is locked to the stimulus. So you average across participants first or across repeats within a participant, and then you do the spectral analysis, and you get basically exactly the same result. So the short answer to your question is there's very good reasons to worry about it, about fMRI, and it just turned out that it was actually fine. Partly because even though fMRI is super slow, these actual neural processes also turn to be super slow. They have genuine super slow components. And secondly, because we could just we could find stimulus locked components of the response. Yeah.
Hey, Thea.
Hey, thank you guys so much for inviting.
Thanks for coming.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Thea.
Yeah.
Nice to see your work. So I asked a question way at the beginning, so maybe some of the answer you've already gotten to. But generally, I was really interested in the idea of what makes a brain region slow. So I was thinking about, say, like your music comprehension study. And what you had is you had different areas of cortex and they're all behaving more and more slowly. But if you think about what we know about cortex, they all have these same cortical column structures. So I guess I was trying to get closer to the biology and ask, you know, when we're even looking at similar cortex, we have a sense of what's making it slow. And kind of getting towards the level of, like you said, maybe we can go to a mouse or something and explore what makes slower versus faster neural circuits.
Yeah, so there's a paper by Rishidev Chowdhury. It's a neuron paper from 2016 maybe. Where there, the claim was it's about the density of recurrent excitatory connections. That was kind of one of the basically there's a gradient. So empirically, if you look at the I believe it's spine density on pyramidal neurons, it increases as you move from the sensory periphery inwards. So that's just like saying it's a positive feedback process. And as you tune the amount of positive feedback, you if you get to the critical level of positive feedback, right, you have the perfectly sustained, perfectly balanced kind of thing. But as you are below that, you get these kind of slow ramps, right? So that's just that's one big mechanism. The other mechanism also discussed in that paper is this kind of chaining, right? So if the information arrives in stage 1 and then onto stage 2, you get the slow. But that's not the local kind of the cortical column kind you're talking about. And then a third kind is interregional feedback, which I actually didn't mention earlier, right? So if you think about that Meshulam diagram that I showed before, this you can also show. This was shown in a paper by Alex Berea in 2013. He showed that if you just have a network of randomly connected nodes, I believe, and each node is a linear filter, then the nodes with highest degree will have the slowest dynamics. So this would say, the prediction here is, and by the way, so generally as you move from the sensory periphery deeper into the brain, the number of interregional connections increases as well on average. So, so one other thing that would predict a longer timescale, not local sourced, but kind of macro sourced, would be just having more interregional connections. Now, there's also a paper. There's a paper from Amri Barak, I believe, which tries to it reviews a couple of different mechanisms for getting local circuits to have what he called a working memory, but he meant something a bit kind of like a mixture of these different things. One of them is a classic one is NMDA receptor density. Another one is the way that like calcium is trafficked presynaptically in general, I believe, or whether it accumulates. And then, there's also work. Sorry, so I should say I'm not a cellular biologist at all. So this stuff is really just not. But I'm aware of this work. There's work from Shimon Marom. I'm not sure where he is in Israel. Either at the Hebrew University, or maybe at the Weizmann, but he has looked at in vitro very, very slow dynamics in like little patches of tissue, and he finds effects that are like multi-day effects. Even in and his broad argument is that there's kind of like an entire zoo of channel kinetic effects that by themselves can account for timescales on the scale of like minutes and hours, right? So I don't know if that helps to answer your question. I guess what I'm trying to convey to you is I'm a little bit hopeless at ever getting a mechanistic answer to this question in humans in the next decade, right? Not because we can't think of a mechanism, it's because we can think of too many mechanisms. That's kind of my problem. Yeah.
Can I ask one follow-up, or is there no time? Okay. Just following up with that then, like, do you have any intuition about whether you think, for example, any piece of cortex could be a slow piece of cortex? Like, do you feel like there's any rules that might be governing that?
I'm not totally understanding so I listed a bunch of things that I think are correlated with having slower dynamics.
Well, yeah, so I'm just knowing that, say, these different regions you find are default mode regions, but, have the possibility of interconnections, these channels, NMDA, pyramidal cells, whatever. There's no constraints you're finding that would say certain regions of cortex are more likely to be slow. Like, there's no mechanism or criteria you think that could cause a region to be more slow from the data you have.
I'm not understanding something. I think I'm giving you reasons. I think I'm saying these are causal. So, for example, recurrence is causal. But maybe there's something. So I think that on average, if you take a piece of tissue and if it's not, having seizures, if that piece of tissue is, and then you increase excitatory recurrence, I think that will slow the dynamics on average. Yeah.
There is, Cynthia, work on this about the prefrontal cortex and why it's the slowest, for instance. It has the slowest of everywhere else, especially anterior PFC. One idea is that its interconnectivity is also higher than other regions, even if you just look at anatomical connections. And there is another idea about its layers. So I don't remember what it was, but I don't know if it's layer 5 or something. Like, some connection is just different in terms of the architecture of the layers in the PFC. And so if you look at the Foster book, The Prefrontal Cortex, it has an entire chapter about why its cells are slower. And also Ramnani and Owen, I think 2001, they have a Nature Reviews Neuroscience, I think 2001, about anterior prefrontal cortex, and then they compare, for instance, with other their layers with other layers, and they compare it across different species who do have some equivalent of it. For instance, there was also some work at Oxford, I think, using functional connectivity to find the equivalence of Brahman area 10 in anterior prefrontal cortex in humans versus monkeys and rodents. Turns out, like, monkeys don't have quite all of the same connected regions that are in anterior prefrontal cortex. So based on connectivity and based on the different layers and the kinds of cell types also, these three things, at least I've seen in the Foster book and in the literature on prefrontal cortex, why some of them are slower than others. And the connectivity is very close to what Chris was saying in terms of recurrence as well. So if you have a region that interconnectivity, not external connectivity with others, but within connectivity in that region is high, then you're more likely to get a lot of recurrence there. And PFC in particular is one of those. It's very dense interconnectivity going on there. And that's one of the reasons that Chris was mentioning. But I do recommend looking at the Foster book for the different layers differences and for the cellular types, which I don't remember exactly how they described it there, unfortunately, right now. But very good question.
Also, I forgot to mention, there's also one other mechanism it's a big class of mechanisms, which is, I can't believe I left this out, neuromodulation. Well, I'm not going to say anything. There's just an enormous different ways that slow neuromodulation could influence these processes and does. Also, there are interesting gradients in receptor densities for different neuromodulators, which also in many cases are correlated with the empirically observed time constants in some of these areas.
Thank you guys so much for inviting me on. It was really thought-provoking, and yeah, it's been great.
Thank you, Thea.
Thanks,
So
Thea.
Chris, before we bring the next person, so Chris, usually in these sessions, we try to connect ideas of one particular person to the broader ideas of, or the research of the particular guest that's speaking, to the broader ideas of learning, bridges and contentions in learning in artificial and biological agents, right? So for instance, when we had the session with bonobos and chimpanzees, we started asking, okay, the same way that we can ask what is the criteria for them to have meaning, what is the criteria for artificial intelligence? So how do you think, because there are different computational ideas of how to incorporate multi-scale representations, multi-scale memory, multi-scale integration. There are very different ideas of how to integrate them in computationally. I think, Jovo, you might need to mute yourself. And what do you think, what would you say based on your particular theory compared to other sort of hierarchical or multi-scale theories? What do you think would be the unique contributions we could have for AI? So going back to from biological learning to artificial learning, because the multi-scale, I think it's going to be an important thing how to realize it. I know that you have other work where you've worked on neural networks. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that too. And you also have a wonderful paper recently with Morgan Berens about the structure of real world memory. Yeah. So I wonder how this multi-scale will allow AI to have that kind of structure of real world memories.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. I'm a little bit daunted by the, so we have put forward some models. So in the paper that I was describing, in which we measured the kind of alignment of the two groups of people and how quickly the alignment occurred across regions, we presented a model there that was a stack of hierarchical autoencoders in time. So the idea there is that each patch of cortex is like a little autoencoder in time. It is trying to form compressed representations of a prior context representation that it maintains and its current input. And then what it passes on to the next level of processing is either kind of like its interpreted compressed representation of past and current input together, or in cases where the model finds that it can't compress the past and the present, it's kind of a surprised moment, then it passes forward a representation of the current input that it received. It's like, I can't handle this. This model, I wouldn't say it's going to be. It's one of those models that isn't going to compete with the kind of the latest production level, multi-scale LSTM or transformer kind of model. Just in terms of, fitting it on an enormous corpus and achieving extremely high accuracy. So it's not. I don't think that this model is making a contribution to AI at that level.
Right.
But I do think that the model raises it has a couple of important ingredients, which I think are worth thinking about. The first one is that the model that we trained was not trained end to end. All of the units in the model were autonomously trained. They were all autoencoders, and there are mechanisms for training autoencoders that are actually relatively biologically plausible. And this goes back to the 80s, right? So end-to-end stuff, training big end-to-end networks without backprop is really hard, as far as I understand. But training littler networks without backprop is actually a lot easier. So I think our model is a contribution in the sense that it's proposing that maybe if what you want to do, if one part of your learning goal is just to learn the association between your own context representation and your own input that you're receiving now, maybe it's a plausible model for how that can work, this kind of autoencoder model operating locally. The second thing that's important about the model maybe is this reset mechanism that it uses. So we are familiar with the fact that like LSTMs were kind of influential or important because they had this way of kind of updating and forgetting this kind of stored cell state, right? And it's a very flexible way of processing sequences. Our model was much less flexible, but I think in some ways also more a bit more plausible for a model of a distributed, a more independent kind of distributed form of information processing. So because the resetting is just driven entirely by local surprise. And I should mention that this idea comes from a paper by Maréchal and French. So we adapted the model from Maréchal and French that they used for modeling sequence learning, like behavioral sequence learning data. So that's one of the other nice things about this model is that it naturally captures actually behavioral data in sequence learning because it was adapted from a model that was designed for that exact purpose, but we figured out kind of just a way to stack the model. There's a related paper from Yashar Bengyo's group, Chung, An, and Bengyo, I think 2018 maybe, NeurIPS, if I'm remembering right, or maybe it's just on the archive. I think it's on the archive. And that was a model that had a similar kind of thing going on with multiple timescales built in and a stacked layers. And then the higher layers of the model ended up learning kind of more sustained structures in a kind of a NLP task. There's also there's something called a clockwork RNN that I've never played with myself, but also instantiates it instantiates a prior on timescales across layers. And again, you find that when you instantiate this kind of bias to slower dynamics, that those layers often learn the information that varies more on a slower timescale. I'm not sure if okay, so that's a little bit that I had to say about some of the modeling that we've done.
I really am curious about what you didn't finish your sentence. You said compared to the Bengio stacked model and the clockwork RNN with priors of timescales across layers. I was waiting for you to give the punchline of your model compared to those two.
So I think our model is simpler and more biologically plausible as a model of something that the cortex could plausibly be doing. I don't think those other models are biologically plausible, but I don't think they were trying to be, just to be clear. But yeah, and they do better at their job, which is producing low perplexity scores, right?
I tried to summarize the things that you said in the chat, so take a look if this is accurate. So although your model doesn't scale, it has 2 key features. I added 3. You first said 2, but I think 3 might be better. 1, there are local encoders. 2, there is a reset mechanism by local surprise on behavioral sequence learning, which is stacked. This gives rise to more flexible and more plausible model. And then 3rd, compared to Bengio's stacked model and the clockwork RNN, which has priors of timescales across layers, your model is simpler and more bioplausible.
I guess, yeah. And actually, I don't know. We don't know for sure that it won't scale. We just, I would be surprised if without modification it scales. Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for that. These 3 points are definitely helpful for me to understand. So, and to the second part of my question, you have this wonderful new paper with Morgan Berens about the structure of real-world memory. I wonder, to what extent do you think your kind of model helps to give rise to or account for the kind of structure of real-world memories? And if you want to say a little bit about that paper too, because we wanted to hear more.
Thank you for saying. So I actually, I'm really excited about this paper. Thank you for asking about it. This is work by Tyler Tommy.
Thank you, Jovo, for reminding me.
Oh, okay, thanks. Is this like one of those talk shows where like somebody has like a book and then they like go on there and then their publisher like gets them a slot on the show and then they like sell more copies of the book? So we have this preprint on bioRxiv. It's the lead author is Tomita. And this is a study. I'm just going to zoom out for a second. This is a study that we started with Morgan Berens because we were actually trying to build a device to help people with memory deficits. So the idea was that they could record events from their lives, and then we would find a way to, in some way, optimally or at least intelligently replay events from their lives to them to help their memory. Okay, specifically memory for episodes from their lives. So then we started asking ourselves, what does learning and memory theory tell us about how we should do this, right? And one of the things we realized, hi, Tyler. So one of the things we realized is that
I can't seem to hear anyone.
Okay.
We hear you. Do you hear me? Okay, I'm gonna tell Tyler in the chat to go to Chrome and reset.
Okay. So one of the things that we realized is that if you want to organize memories for replaying them to people, you need to know which memories are similar to other memories, because almost all kind of memory theory says that inter-item similarity is important for things like interference and retrieval and associability, all kinds of things. So then the question just was, if I have 2 real-world events, 2 memories from my life, which ones are similar? And we realized that we actually had no idea, because any 2 events in your life could have all kinds of different dimensions, like people, location, the main activity you were involved in, and we just there was just very little on this. So we set out to try and characterize what makes two real-world memories, two memories from your life, similar. And we ran these experiments where we had people give us a memory from their lives and then give us another memory from their lives. And then they told us how similar they are overall. And then they annotated the memories along all kinds of different dimensions, like who was there, where they were, how far apart they were, indoors and outdoors, and different kinds of adjectives they would associate with them. And we, going into this, coming from kind of like a, modeling kind of, I don't know, background, and I really thought that the most important dimensions, this is what I thought, were going to be space and time. I thought things that happen nearby in space and nearby in time are going to be the things that are considered most similar. And we were surprised because the things that seemed to be the most influential in people's treating two memories as similar were two things. One, how similar they are emotionally, how they felt about them. And the second was kind of the primary activity they were involved in. But this emotion effect, we're not emotion researchers. So, I mean, we really did not set out to find this. So then, getting back to your initial question of how this all relates, emotion is a very slowly changing part of our, so there's something called affect and something called emotion. I'm not sure that I fully know the difference between them. I think I misuse the terms, but our emotional states and our affect are very slowly changing parameters. And one kind of version of emotion research, it focuses on things like suddenly being scared by like a snake or a scorpion or whatever, right? Now, that's a very sudden form of emotional change. But another form of emotion research kind of focuses on emotions as kind of like interpretations in some sense, interpretations of the deep structure of the environment that you're in.
Or even context, emotional as a context of it.
Yeah, right. And so there's a certain sense in which this very, very slow time scale that you see in this innermost part of yourself is probably also very related to emotion. And the, I need to get this right, the anterior components of the MTL are especially linked to emotional processes as well. So one idea is that, and this maybe relates to some of your work, Ida, in terms of like cached value representations, I would imagine, is that one idea is that when you're in a situation and you want to decide what to do and you need to retrieve relevant memories, the emotion that you kind of experience at the time is actually like this. It's not just some kind of brute, am I feeling okay right now? It's actually this like carefully, subtly calibrated, interpreted world state that you have cached. And then later on, if you want to make some kind of decision and you have limited time for reasoning, you can actually retrieve it. So I think that actually relates to your work on successor representation and cached value, I think.
That said, I have never thought about it as being used in this. So actually, you're right that it could be useful for modeling the data from that paper. I had never made the connection myself, but I can see why you mean that. So there could be basically, the successor representation as a policy thing. And that policy, if it's a policy for fear versus for joy or versus something else, it has an entirely different matrix of associations. From the same world state. So in the same apartment I'm living or in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn, depending on what affective state it is, it could be that different things are available to me. In one case, let's say I'm in a protest and the police is attacking us, and this happens in Brooklyn often, then you got to run in a certain way, or you have to make sure to protect the younger or the weakest, see if somebody is like hurt so you can help them. So that's the kind of mindset. But if it's a nice stroll, you might want to optimize, not stepping into like dog poop. If it's a situation with COVID, you want to make sure you're 6 feet apart from people. So there is a sense of, so you're right, that different kind of context, and I wouldn't call them emotions in this case, like more broadly different contexts would require different ways of activating associations of the same environment, depending on the kind of influence of the affective context on your policy. So that's an interesting suggestion. Now, regardless of the emotion component of it, I wonder to what extent you think that structure of similarity obviously comes, or let's say not comes up, maybe the best word is emerges from a particular rule for learning and forming these associations in memory. And so there is something that is the rule for learning and forming these memories that leads to certain similarity structures later on once the memories are formed or being retrieved. And so our model, my model, and the people who use similar models, we have some ideas of linking the learning component to the similarity structure later on. And that's the part where I was hoping that you could connect the multi-scale model that you presented earlier in your talk today to the similarity structure that might be observed later in these kind of memories. And how potentially this could inform how AI could have human-like real-world memories.
Yeah. So like when I'm, like kind of shower thoughts, I definitely think that if you, again, you have to get this to work, but if you force some part of an AI system to try and track and maintain context over unusually long scales and make them useful, that those contexts are going to, and also in the context of some policy, right, and some kind of decision-making setting, those are going to end up starting to resemble something kind of like an emotion and something kind of like a situation representation, right? I say emotion, but it's just that these emotional terms so often are like situation representations in themselves in some ways. The particular ones that stood out in the study. Yeah. Yeah. So. One necessary kind of precondition for this, though, is that you have to, this is kind of what Jova was saying earlier, is that like these AI systems kind of can't show us this stuff unless we put them in an environment where it matters, right? So, imagine that you had like, I know people are doing this stuff. I'm sure they are doing this, but an artificial life setting where you have a multiple AI agents interacting in an environment in a collaborative way, then these kinds of representations and processes might be more useful for them. And also, so if what you're doing is classifying, ImageNet, then they're not going to be useful.
Also, if you have lifelong learning, so for me, it would be helpful if I have some kind of a emotion like fear template, so that every time I'm in a fear situation, I can activate some series or make accessible certain affordances, as opposed to the hunger or the joy or some other kind of templates that are in the long run recurring things.
Yeah, so this entire thing that I described today, it had a very kind of perceptual feeling to it, right? Like just about you're the passive recipient of all of this stuff and you're interpreting it. And I didn't say anything about acting or predicting over long scales. And I think that's kind of just a missing, we just haven't worked on that, but I think it's critical. And I think that especially this emotion work got me to like think about that a lot more. This autobiographical memory work, which in turn revealed I was just so surprised by how important action and emotion were that's really kind of, it revealed a bit of a blind spot to me in my own thinking about these large-scale principles of brain organization. Yeah.
So I tried to summarize again what this discussion that we just had, and thank you so much for engaging with it, that perhaps long-term context tracking could lead to situation representation in AI models. And a necessary precondition would be to put them in environments that where the environment matters. For instance, an artificial life setting where multiple agents interact, or a lifelong learning where similar situations recur over time. And so then maybe AI will have a real life type memory representation.
So Ida, I was going back to the intro when you mentioned Cards Against Humanity. I remember the game that we played, and there was a particular Cards Against Humanity card, and one of the choices was teaching a robot to love. That was one of the answers on one of the Cards Against Humanity. Yeah, I've never forgotten that particular answer. Yeah. Anyway.
Did I give that answer?
No, I predicted that answer for Janice, I think.
I see. That's funny. So for everyone here, this game was played in 2013, so I'm very impressed that you remember anything.
I'm probably misremembering it, but that's a real Cards Against Humanity card, teaching robots to love, and yeah.
Cool.
I just want to add, that was a really interesting and helpful conversation, so thanks so much, both of you, for engaging it. The other thing, I just want to connect it to some of the stuff that John Langford talked about, because the structure of how we organize our memories impacts the retrieval rate with which we can encode them. So John talked about these hierarchical representations, which can lead to fast retrieval. And so we don't necessarily need to query AI in lifelong learning kind of scenarios, but if the metric becomes the rate at which you can retrieve information in the vast databases of knowledge, like Jeopardy playing or whatever, this also could be really useful in certain kinds of contexts. So I think it has very widespread implications for how to think about AI. And like you said, a blind spot that lots of people, certainly I have, that just never occurred to me to think about it like that.
Can you tell us again, like, how are you connecting to John Langford? So you're saying the structure of memories. Yeah, I think I missed the connection.
So to get fast memory retrieval, you want to store things in a tree. But how do you decide how to organize your tree? So, Chris's original point was he thought we should organize it spatially and temporally, which makes sense because that's how things impinge upon our sensory apparatus. But what he's showing is it seems like that's not actually how we organize it, at least according to some metrics. We organize it in a tree of emotional states. And so that's a jump. But
episodic memory is a thing, and category memory is a thing, and the shape of what constitutes a dog. That's also a different kind of organization. It's based on features in this case, not necessarily the emotions. So I want to make sure that, yeah.
I also want to just qualify by saying it's difficult to probe the organization of memory independent of a particular retrieval task. And in this particular case, the retrieval task that people are engaged in, it has a kind of a high-level situation feeling to it. So in the context of action in a situation, in a rich situation, I think this is, I would say. But you could be in other contexts where, for whatever reason, we're able to just prioritize, like, does it have 3 sides, or something else like that as a relevant feature for search.
Right, and I'm not saying that's how we do it or we should do it. I'm just pointing out that we do need to store memories in a structure to enable efficient retrieval.
Yeah.
And I never thought about this kind of structure before.
So the nice thing, Jovo, about successor feature representations is that depending on your policy or depending on the situation or context, you can have different features being the dominant reason for forming your memory in one way or other. So let's say how many edges something has can be one feature. What kind of emotion or what kind of action it affords, that's another feature or set of features. And its spatial and temporal context is another set of features, right? So that's the nice thing about certain kinds of memories that can afford forming different types of predictive representations of the same situation. And I think that that's what Chris was very quickly coming to his mind and mentioning a couple of, I think like 10, 20 minutes ago, that that could be a way that these kinds of multi-feature ways of representing the same environment, depending on the situation at hand or depending on the action that's required of me or depending on the task that's required of me. I think that could be used, for instance, with this successor feature learning. For instance, it could be based on the task set, or it could be based on the, if the task is category, if the task is, do you need to survive? If the task is, you need to figure out where to go to, I don't know, from here to home or something like that. These different tasks would make me represent different features of the environment and different parts of it be accessible to me in the memory. And I like that Chris very quickly made that link. So I agree with you, Jovo, that It's a nice connection to John Langford's work. And I want to highlight David Silver and folks at DeepMind. They had a paper where they had multi-policy successor representations, where you had multiple ones of them, successor feature learning, depending on the task at hand. So it's not a new thing. They have computationally done that in the deep learning context. But I love that the way that Chris framed it makes it possible to potentially apply it to this kind of real world organization of memories, which would require us to understand the statistical learning of the relevant features for different situations and tasks in the real world. So I think that was a very deep comment, Chris. The more we are talking, the more I'm unpacking that one sentence you said.
But that's still a hard problem. And it comes back in some ways to some of John's questions in the very beginning about like, okay, so really what is a narrative? Like give me the structured version of the story. Like how do you, that's hard. So I think we have a pretty good parts list for things like narratives and situations. I think we have a pretty good parts list. But I don't think we have much in terms of, there's some pretty low hanging fruit. One idea that I think there might be some work on this, but I can't bring it to mind. You might ask questions about like which things can contain which things. So for example, if you have an agent representation, does that need to be contained in a space? Maybe this is a ridiculous question, but like, do you need a spatial scaffold of some kind to contain agents, or can agents be spaceless? It seems that you can definitely have space without an agent, right? So simple questions like that, like in terms of like if you have this parts list, like what are the potential connections between them? That seems like the kind of thing maybe you should ask if you want to start getting to a kind of a computationally firm version of the story about the features of situations. Yeah.
I think that you and I being immigrants, we can imagine spaceless agents a little easier. Very cool discussion. I think that the next person is our very own Brad. Is Brad here? Brad and Mohammed Ashteb are the next high voted question.
Brad's here. I tried to invite Tyler because he's the first author on that work. I figured anything Chris said that was wrong, he could correct, but he had difficulties.
Unfortunately, his video didn't work, and then his audio also. He kept being.
Put a link to his paper in the thing if I can find it.
Oh, I did put a paper.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, I can post it again if that helps. Oh, there's Brad. Hi, Brad.
Brad, is that a different computer from 1980 than normal?
This one's from a certain TV show. Let's see if anybody can figure it out. Hi, Chris. Good to see you again.
Oh, hi.
Oh, hey.
Hey.
Oh, is it from Action Force? Which TV show is it? Is it Action Force?
Transformers.
Oh, there you go. Good. Close in time, though.
But not in emotional state.
Yeah, I had a question about what were your thoughts or perhaps findings on maybe privileged timescales of narrative. So, for example, do you think that narrative might be scale-free in the sense that we could sort of construct narrative over arbitrarily long timescales? Or do you think that maybe it sort of taps out at some sort of maximally long structure?
I think once you have the hippocampus involved, you can, and once you've got like, agent motor feedback involved, I think you can reason about narratives or make sense of narratives, of arbitrary kind of length, right? But I do kind of feel like, so I do think that maybe another way to ask this question would be something like this, to say, how long can a sentence be, right? So, imagine I have a paragraph. People, there's some authors, I guess, that are famous for writing one sentence is an entire page, right? And so if one sentence is an entire page, is it still a sentence? There's a certain sense in which it's not. And in that sense, I feel like the construction of a scenario does kind of tap out. This is kind of what I was saying earlier about like the people without hippocampus. If I'm amnesic, I think I can hang on to a kind of a scenario on the scale of around a minute, something, order of magnitude, like maybe 30 seconds to 2 minutes. And outside of that, I really start to think that you need to start stitching things together using an active process of a more explicit active process or binding process or something like that. That's my, I don't know if that answers your question, but in terms of narrative, but in terms of kind of scenario construction, I feel like that might be right.
Yeah, I mean, I think about sort of the ability to comprehend events like in a novel, that you might have been reading for a few hours, right? And so you can have, a sense of sort of how events are connected to each other over that very long time scale. And I guess the question is there truly a sort of integration over that long time scale? Or is it a series of short hops?
Yeah.
You can teleport back and forth within the narrative, perhaps.
Yes. So so this is kind of, so my postdoc advisor, Uri, always used to kind of go on and on about this, about how you have to watch the whole 2-hour movie to really understand that final scene in the movie, to really feel it the way the director wants you to feel it, right? And so, I do think you are using you are doing hopping around, you are using MTL structures over the course of that 2-hour movie, but somehow there is an accumulation of some kind of information. And this is more in that kind of like automatic, passive, parallel kind of way that I was mentioning to John in the very beginning. That does seem to accumulate on the scale of, I don't know, an hour or more. Maybe if I was doing like an ayahuasca ceremony and doing 64 hours consecutively of chanting or something, maybe I would find that you can really tell the difference between 64 hours and 56 hours or whatever. But I think more routinely, we do experience the difference between like a half-an-hour TV show and a 2-hour movie, right? There is often an emotional difference. Like the way it hits you can be different. Your level of emotion is different. So, and in terms of mechanism, how you're getting out to those scales, it seems like it's way beyond the time scale of the ones that are commonly discussed, right? So maybe some of Shimon Morom's stuff about single cell, receptor inactivation processes or something is somehow, you have to find the long time scale somehow. Or it could be an emergent phenomenon in the recurrence.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. I agree that there's still a whole lot of things that we don't understand there. And going back to, I want to echo sort of John's point that he'd made earlier, which is that I still think there's, the sort of magic sauce of what narrative is that we still don't quite have. And I'm really looking forward to sort of figuring out what that might be. And is it, perhaps like a sort of, a latent space in which stories can sort of most easily exist. And I think about this. I mean, my wife is a folklorist, and so we spend a lot of time talking about stories.
Sorry, the audio cut out there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I was saying,
your wife is
thinking about stories. My wife is a folklorist, and
okay.
So we, in folklore, you find that there are a lot of tale types that sort of recur across time, between different cultures. And so the same stories keep reemerging. And it sort of suggests that there might be certain kinds of stories that fit well within our ability to comprehend narrative.
I think also another version of this is in psychiatry, right? Why does schizophrenia, for example, so often involve these recurring characters? It's like, obviously this is culture specific, but like it's the queen and it's the moon and it's like God, and it's like, right? There are certain kind of latent spaces that these entities are being drawn from. It's not, and so I do think that there's a connection there, and I agree with you that it's fascinating, and there may be some connection between the recurring entities in folklore and the recurring entities in psychiatry. Yeah. I guess probably Jung said this like 100, 120 years ago. Maybe I'm just like repeating something he said 120 years ago.
I personally think that we can, if we do an NLP on a text corpus from a given era, it can predict what kind of scenarios are going to appear in schizophrenics. For instance, in the Cold War era, it was always some spies that were talking to them. In another era, the radio was sending messages. In another era, pop songs were sending messages. And I think in our era, well, the NSA is listening to all of us. So basically, there is no more schizophrenia. All of us are being really observed. So that's a very good point. The link between folklore and the kind of latent space of the kinds of narratives that might appear in psychosis. I think that's honestly, I have personally hoped that one day I could do that, the NLP on one versus the other, and look at the correspondence and do it by era, because then it wouldn't be as Jungian. So it's not just the ancient stuff, it's also just the stuff that's very much on the news, like Russian spies. And up to the 90s, that was very much, captured. And also it kind of lingered on, but now it's gone because there's no more spies. Everybody has a device that's spying on them. And for a while, it was also, there is some chip in some people's brains. So the number of emails I have personally received by people saying there's a chip in their brain, for instance, or a lot of people received that who were doing fMRI in the early 2010s or late 2000s, I guess. It seems like it advances with the technology of the time. So it's not entirely Jungian. You don't have an archetype for a chip.
I should mention that when I was doing my postdoc many years ago and I had time to read things, I did read into this. So there actually is a literature that was a lot of it starts with like in the 60s. Marsha Johnson did like Bransford and Johnson. Am I getting this right? Bransford and Franks and some of Marsha Johnson's work, identifying the kind of the elements of situation representation, the being a situation model. There's also like Walter Kinch. But then, this is why I'm trying to get to the point. People started to ask more specific questions, kind of like, suppose I can change the agent, but not the location, or I change the amount of time between two events, but not the agent. And they try to like do these manipulations where they parametrically determine like which are the most important features for constraining this particular scene, like which features will interfere in memory, which won't, and so forth. And my reading, I think there were about maybe 10 papers, and this is like in the 70s and early 80s, if I'm remembering, on this theme. And my rough impression was that it was a complete mess. Like they just totally failed. Like they couldn't get things so the studies didn't agree with each other. Everything depended hugely on the exact materials that were used. So people did make an attempt at kind of trying to just do good old psychology experiments and then parametrically manipulate these factors of a scenario or a narrative as if they were factors like any other dimensional system. And my impression of that is that it did not work. Yeah. I think space worked okay, because with space, we got all the hippocampal stuff, we had all the rodent stuff to kind of cross-reference against. But like the other dimensions, like agents and goals, I mean, maybe goals now we're doing okay, But time, maybe time we're doing better. Maybe we should revisit this. Maybe it's time to revisit that failed kind of effort from the 70s and 80s, now that we have better neuroscience of time and goals and agents, maybe. Yeah.
I think there's going to be some very hard problems there. I think that sort of understanding narrative is kind of in the same ballpark as common sense and meaning, and the sort of like...
I think it might be easier.
Conscious.
Yes.
I personally think it's a little easier. I do think that AI with a good representation of meaning, or like meaning, not the dualist notion of meaning that needs a soul, but the notion of meaning that it would know what to do with it. Meaning for narrative at different time scales. I think that's not too far. But I
agree with you. I agree.
But I think this is further, much further.
The real heartbreak is going to be the question of when the narratives that the AIs generate are heartbreaking. That is going to be the part that when our hearts get broken, when they write heartbreaking narratives, because I can't really face that personally. But I do think that they will succeed in producing narratives that like a kid would, really enjoy and that we would find difficult to distinguish from something generated by an everyday, kind of typical non-author person.
One thing I want to mention is that there was recently a paper that I really appreciated, that it was talking about a form of information transfer that would pass information across millennia. And they suggested that folklore would be the compact representation that would allow humans to pass information for millennia, I guess like mythology and folklore. So that was a very interesting paper. I'll try to find it.
Yeah, Dean Dudai was this his work? He has work on the notion of kind of like cultural memory of like the Jewish people and like treating them as like a remembering entity, and then the texts as like, I'm not sure what role the texts play, whether there would be maybe, but one of the cool things is retrieval, right? So you can have something that happens in the environment now to the culture, and then they retrieve relevant memories from the literature in some sense. And so it was kind of like, that was a really interesting idea.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of people had questions that they asked that I would ask you. Thank you, Brad.
Thanks, Brad.
Mohammed Asqaib asked, which is very related to the paper that you have with Tyler. With regards to the question, why do stories linger? Do emotions or emotional memories play a role? And yeah.
Yes, so the single most, so I think yes is roughly speaking the answer. There's work on emotion induction, which is surprisingly effective. So you can just present people with words of a certain valence, whatever, and you can change their emotional state, as far as I understand. I think the effects that we were finding, though, go beyond that, but it's worth mentioning. So this story that people were reading in one of our experiments was a story about a woman whose husband comes back from a hunting trip with some friends. And while they're on the hunting trip, they find a young woman's body, right? And the story, you kind of learn this, but then it turns out the wife starts to kind of suspect that maybe the husband and his hunting buddies were involved with this body in some way that, so maybe they actually murdered her, right? This is kind of this is kind of a dark story. And by far the dominant feature of what lingered was this concept of murder and the image of the mental image of the body. It's like, yeah. So, and I think also that kind of just accords with our experience. Like you go into a movie theater in the days when we could go into movie theaters, and you're kind of coming out of the movie theater, and one of the things that's most obviously lingering in that moment where you're in this crowd of people, you all have this kind of emotional state. I think emotion is a major piece of what lingers. But I'm hopeful that it's a version of emotion that's a more kind of interesting, rich kind of emotion that reflects, like Ida was saying before, things to do with relevant courses of action and situational features, rather than just just valence.
So what a fantastic note for transitioning to Harrison's question. Harrison asks, and he had to leave, but he asks, the talk was focused on timescales for perception, but could you say more about how this interacts with action?
Yeah, geez. So I mean, in terms of decision making and planning and so forth, there's all of the successor representation stuff. There actually was a paper, I think, maybe in the last few months that specifically looked at this question. There is also, I believe, so it's worth mentioning, in the action domain is the classic work from I think the Japanese monkey electrophysiology work, showing that premotor cortex encodes like kind of sequences of movement, and then motor cortex is encoding kind of the individual movements, right? And I think there's even an SMA kind of step to that hierarchy, right? And those typically correspond to longer timescales, obviously, because when you plan a sequence of movement, you're obviously planning something that is more extended in time than the individual movement you're about to present. So I think even the classic motor planning literature already tells you that there is a hierarchy, a reverse hierarchy in the motor domain. but I think, and also there's also work from like Dale Lee's lab and Xiaojing Wang's lab that I'm trying to get this exactly right, but like the single units that exhibit slower dynamics spontaneously are also involved in tracking credit assignment in learning problems, where the credit assignment is more removed in time. If I'm getting this right, I think I'm remembering that right. So both in the RL world and in the just immediate motor, there's definitely a parallel kind of story. There's another piece of literature that's very relevant here. Yeah. I guess one other thing to say with all of this is like under a predictive coding framework, if you're a predictive coding person, then in some sense there's like hardly any difference between these two. So you know, memory for the past and prediction of the future are like deeply interwoven. So there are some models, some of the Friston and associated groups models have this character where they're hierarchical. So there's a paper by Keeble and Friston that I cited, I believe, where once you have a generative model, if your generative model is hierarchical, then it's both action and perception are in the same hierarchy, if that makes sense. So that's another flavor of answer to your question. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Elliot Smith asks, insula also looks more outer in that inner-outer slide, but wouldn't you expect that to be more inner given its involvement with interception?
Well, maybe so I just want to be clear when I say inner. Oh, I see. Okay, well, there's two versions of this. One of them is, this is another one of the counterexamples. And the other one, it would just be like the word inner. What does the word inner mean, right? So, yeah. I guess I should say, firstly, I don't think that the insula is only involved in basic forms of interoception. As far as I understand, it's also involved in fairly, some parts of the insula are involved in more kind of like rich emotional and other kind of evaluative processes. And secondly, I'll say, I do believe that empirically, the insula doesn't have a short time scale. Just empirically, it doesn't. Yeah. In terms of hops from the world, you know, I don't know, maybe going into your like mouth counts as a hop. So you get one hop going in the mouth, then you have to like affect the guts. No, that's my escape card. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Card. There's a lot of questions, to be honest, but how are you doing? Because it's already 6:30, and I know that you have a now 5-year-old. Like, how old?
She's 3. She's 3.
3-year-old, yes.
Yeah, I need to go and have dinner with my family.
Yeah.
So John had to leave earlier because he has to go take care of his mom who has COVID, and we hope that John's mom is doing well. But Chris, thank you. This was a fantastic discussion. Especially, I particularly enjoyed the last hour of it. It's always good to have these long discussions because the initial part is just to get over the formal, here is the thing and here is the, clarifications. And I think the last hour is always the most exciting hour where we can go deep and get more speculative and draw connections to bigger ideas. So I really appreciate that you gave us a full 2.5 hours so we can go from the kind of the clarifications to this bigger picture discussions we just had. I really appreciated it. I hope that the people in the audience appreciated it too. Q, thank you. I want to thank you, Q, as well for the comments you provided in the chat. I want to thank everyone. The chat was very active and wonderful as always, but there were a lot of clarifications by various people in the chat because your students showed up, Chris, and your postdocs, and they kind of helped out. So I really appreciate their participation too.
Oh, thank you to everyone. I didn't keep up with the chat, so I apologize if there were things that I should have responded to. I thank you for. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we would like to thank you. We would also like to thank John and Brad, who were on screen, but also Claire and Eva. Eva really saved us by creating another session in the beginning. So special thanks to Claire and Eva for making this happen. And thank you, Worldwide Neuro.
Yeah, Tim and Worldwide Neuro came through clutch. That was great.
All right. Happy Nowruz. Salon Mubarak to the
Nowruz.
Americans out there.
Thanks, everybody.
Next week. Thank you. See you, Chris.